Hello and welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. Get comfortable. Pull your blanket up a little. Adjust your pillow. There you go. Tonight we are going to talk about Vikings. Now, before your brain perks up and starts picturing horned helmets and dramatic battle cries and longships crashing through stormy seas, I need you to take all of that, gently set it to one side, and accept that we are going to talk about the real Vikings. The actual, historical, day-to-day reality of being a person who lived in Scandinavia roughly between the years 793 and 1066. And I promise you, it is far more sleep-inducing than the movie version. You think you want to be a Viking? Of course you do. You have seen the television shows. You have seen the video games. You have a vague mental image of yourself with impressive biceps and a fur cloak, standing at the prow of a dramatic ship, the sea spray in your face, the sun setting behind you in a very cinematic way. Here is the truth. If you were somehow transported back to a real Viking settlement in, say, the year 850, your experience would not be cinematic. Your experience would be in rough order: cold, smoky, hungry, smelly in a specific way that you cannot currently imagine, cold again, confused by the language, cold a third time, and then so exhausted from basic survival tasks that you would be asleep before the sun went down, which, in a Scandinavian winter, happens at around 3 in the afternoon. This is a show about that reality. The porridge, the rowing, the smoke in your eyes every morning, the incredibly detailed and slightly obsessive Norse legal system, the surprisingly good Viking hygiene routines, the long winter nights. It is history. It is calm. It is deeply, comfortably boring in the best possible way. So let us begin. Here is your first piece of genuinely useful historical information, delivered at a pace specifically designed to let your eyelids get heavier. The word Viking was not what most Norse people called themselves. They called themselves Norsemen, or Northmen, or simply by the name of the region they came from: Danes, Norwegians, Swedes. The word Viking, Vikingur in Old Norse, referred specifically to the act of raiding. Going a Viking meant going on a raid. It was a verb before it was a noun. What this means, and this is the part that tends to genuinely surprise people, is that the vast majority of Norse people in the Viking Age were not Vikings in the raiding sense at all. They were farmers. They were fishermen. They were craftspeople, traders, herders of sheep and cattle, weavers of cloth, carvers of wood and antler. They were, in other words, ordinary people living ordinary lives in a fairly harsh northern European landscape. The raiding minority got all the attention then, as dramatic minorities tend to do, and they have kept all the attention ever since. But if you were an average person born in Scandinavia in the year 830, your daily concerns were not about which monastery to raid. Your daily concerns were: did we get enough hay in before the first frost? Is the fishing going to hold this year? Is my neighbor going to cause trouble about that boundary stone again? These are not the concerns of a dramatic warrior people. These are the concerns of a hardworking agricultural society trying to feed itself in a place where the growing season is short, the winters are brutal, and the soil in many areas is not particularly cooperative. This does not make them less interesting. If anything, it makes them more interesting, because it makes them human in a way that a shield wall does not. But it does mean that the version of the Viking Age you have probably absorbed from popular culture is a little like learning about modern Americans exclusively from action movies. Technically, some of those things happen, but it is not really the full picture. The word Viking has also shifted in meaning over the centuries. In the medieval Icelandic sagas, which were written down in the 13th and 14th centuries, well after the Viking Age itself had ended, the word could mean anything from a pirate to an adventurer to simply a man who had gone abroad. By the time the 19th century Romantic movement got hold of the concept, It had expanded to mean an entire mythologized warrior race with great beards and noble souls, and a special relationship with fate. None of that is quite accurate, but it is a very comfortable myth. And myths are how people make sense of the past when the actual past is too complicated and too full of hay gathering to make a good story. Let us set the myths down gently. Let us pull up a stool by this smoky fire and talk about what life was actually like. Let us begin where you would begin, arriving at your new Viking home. It is a longhouse. It is called a longhouse because it is long. This is one of those cases where the historical term is refreshingly literal. A typical Norse longhouse might be anywhere from 15 to over 80 meters in length, though most ordinary farmsteads had longhouses in the 20 to 30-meter range. It is long, it is low, and from the outside it looks like a very large piece of ground has decided to become a building. The walls are made of timber, wattle and daub, or stone depending on where you are in Scandinavia and what materials are locally available. Iceland, which had very little timber, made a lot of turf walls. The roof is typically thatched or covered with turf. There are very few windows, because windows in a Scandinavian winter are primarily a way to let the cold in and the precious warmth out. What windows there are have no glass. Glass is expensive and mostly used by churches and wealthy people. Your windows are covered with treated animal membrane or simply shuttered wood. Step inside. The first thing you notice, even before your eyes adjust, is the smoke. There is no chimney. There is a smoke hole in the roof, centered above the central hearth that runs down the middle of the building. The smoke from the fire is supposed to drift upward and out through this hole. In good weather and with cooperative wind, this works reasonably well. In bad weather, when the wind is blowing in the wrong direction or the air pressure is doing something unfavorable, the smoke simply stays inside the building and you breathe it. Archaeological studies of Norse longhouse remains have found evidence of significant respiratory disease in the skeletons of people who lived in them. Your eyes would water. You would cough. A mild chronic cough was probably just part of daily life for most Norse people, something so normal it was not worth commenting on, the way modern people do not particularly comment on traffic noise. You would adjust. After a few weeks, your eyes would stop watering quite so much. Your lungs would do whatever lungs do when they decide they simply have to cope, and the smell of wood smoke would become so deeply embedded in your clothing and hair that you would no longer notice it. Visitors from outside your settlement, however, would notice it. You would have a very particular smell. Everyone in your community would have this smell. It would be normal. Now the other inhabitants of your longhouse. In many Norse farmsteads, particularly in Norway and Iceland where winters were severe, the longhouse was designed to shelter both humans and animals under the same roof. There might be a partition, a low wall of timber or wattle, separating the human living area from the animal stalls at one end of the building. The animals kept in these winter stalls might include cattle, goats, sheep, and perhaps some pigs. You might wonder why anyone would want to share living space with livestock. The answer is warmth. Cows are very warm. A longhouse with 8 cows in the far end is noticeably warmer than a longhouse without cows, and in a Norse winter, that warmth might be the difference between surviving and not surviving. The smell you would again eventually adjust to. The sleeping arrangements in a Norse longhouse were communal. The raised earthen or wooden platforms that ran along the interior walls of the building served as both seating during the day and sleeping surfaces at night. Everyone slept together in one space. The household, which might include the farming family, their thralls, slaves, and any farmhands or dependent relatives, shared the warmth of the central hearth and the company of everyone else's nighttime sounds. Privacy, in the modern sense, was not a concept that would have been particularly familiar to a Norse person. You slept near other people. You ate near other people. You worked near other people. The idea of having a room to yourself, a door you could close, a space that was exclusively yours, this was not part of the average Norse experience. Your bed, such as it was, consisted of a wooden platform covered with straw, on top of which you laid animal skins and woolen blankets. This was warmer than it sounds. Wool is extraordinarily good insulation, and animal skins are essentially nature's sleeping bag. Norse textiles were of generally high quality because textile production was a critical survival skill, not a decorative hobby. Your blanket was probably well made. It was not, however, a mattress. Sleeping on a wooden platform covered with straw and skins, every night for your entire life, would give you a particular kind of relationship with mornings that involved a lot of back cracking and slow, careful movement. Chronic back pain was extremely common in Viking Age skeletal remains. This is not surprising. Settle in. You are home. Let us talk about what you are going to eat. The centerpiece of the Norse diet, the thing you would eat most often in various forms at various times of day, was porridge. Specifically, a thick gruel made from whatever grain was available, most commonly barley, rye, or oats. This was not steel-cut oatmeal with maple syrup and artisanal berries. This was a dense, gray-brown, unsweetened mass of cooked grain that would be consumed in large quantities, because it was filling, calorie-dense, and relatively easy to make in a cauldron over a fire. You would eat porridge in the morning. You might eat a version of it, perhaps thinner, perhaps with some dried fish stirred in the evening. If you were lucky, a feast day or a good fishing week might bring variety. But porridge was the baseline. Porridge was always there. If there was ever a monument to the Viking Age, it should not be a longship or a battle axe. It should be a large gray bowl of barley porridge, and the inscription should read, "We got through it." Beyond the porridge, the Norse diet was actually reasonably diverse, at least for people who lived near the sea or major rivers. Fish was enormously important. Herring, cod, and various freshwater fish were caught, dried, smoked, or fermented and stored for winter use. Dried cod, called stockfish, was particularly valuable because it could be kept for months or even years without spoiling, and rehydrated for eating. The Norse were responsible for establishing the dried fish trade that would eventually feed much of medieval Europe, which is one of those historical footnotes that tends to get overshadowed by the more exciting facts about raids and ships. Meat was eaten, but was not necessarily daily fare for ordinary people. Cattle, sheep, and goats were kept primarily for their secondary products, milk, wool, labor, rather than for slaughter, because a living cow or sheep gives you things year after year, while a dead one gives you things exactly once. Old or unproductive animals would be slaughtered in the autumn before winter, providing a burst of fresh meat that was then salted, smoked, or otherwise preserved. Wild game, deer, wild boar, hare, birds, was also eaten where available, though how much access ordinary people had to hunting grounds depended heavily on local land rights and social status. Berries, nuts, and wild plants were gathered seasonally. Cabbages, turnips, peas, and beans were grown in kitchen gardens. Apples and plums were cultivated in some areas. Honey was the primary sweetener, used both in food and to make mead. Mead. Let us not skip mead. Mead is fermented honey and water. It varies enormously in quality depending on who made it and how much honey was available, which itself depended on how good the beekeeping had been that year. In good years, mead was sweet, mildly alcoholic, and genuinely pleasant. In bad years or with limited honey, it was thin, slightly sour, and primarily useful as a vehicle for getting through the evening. Beer was also drunk, a thick, cloudy ale brewed from grain, and was probably safer than untreated water in densely settled areas, though Norse settlements were generally spread out enough that water sources stayed relatively clean. Milk and soured milk products like skyr, a strained yogurt product that Icelanders still make and eat today, and which has recently become fashionable in health food stores, which the Norse would find bewildering, were also important parts of the diet. What you would not have is sugar in any concentrated form beyond honey, any spices beyond what could be grown locally, some herbs, perhaps mustard seed, dried berries. Any of the extensive medieval spice trade that was simultaneously making the kitchens of wealthy Southern Europeans much more interesting. And certainly no coffee, no tea, no chocolate, and no tomatoes, potatoes, or anything else from the Americas. The Norse diet was adequate. It was nutritious enough to produce people of above-average height for their era. Norse skeletal remains suggest men averaged around 59, and women around 54, which was tall for the period. It was monotonous. It was heavily dependent on the success of each year's harvest and fishing season. And it required an enormous amount of labor to produce, store, and prepare. Every meal you ate represented hours of work by someone. Usually several someones. The porridge did not appear in the bowl by accident. This is the section where we correct one of the most persistent myths about the Viking Age, specifically the myth that medieval people were universally filthy and had no concept of personal hygiene. The Norse were, by the standards of their era and by the evidence of the archaeological record, remarkably clean people. This is not to say that they had hot showers and antibacterial soap. But relative to many of their contemporaries, including, notably, the Anglo-Saxons they so frequently raided, the Norse put a significant amount of time and attention into personal cleanliness. Archaeological sites throughout Scandinavia and Norse settlement areas have produced enormous quantities of grooming tools. Combs made from antler bone and wood, ear-cleaning scoops, tweezers, small razors. These were not luxury items owned only by the wealthy. They were found in ordinary household contexts, used by ordinary people. Norse people combed their hair. They cleaned their ears. They trimmed their beards. There are contemporary accounts, written by people who encountered Norse raiders or traders, that specifically comment on Norse hygiene habits. A 10th-century Arab traveler named Ibrahim ibn Jacob, who encountered Norse traders in Central Europe, noted that they washed their hands and faces every morning. A later Arab writer described the Norse as washing in a shared basin, which he found unhygienic by his own standards, but the key point is that they were washing. The Norse also had saunas, not as a luxury spa experience, as a regular practical bathing method. Sauna bathing was common throughout Scandinavia and has remained part of Scandinavian culture continuously from the Viking Age to the present day, which may make it one of the longest continuously practiced hygiene habits in Northern Europe. On Saturdays, the Norse called it lagardagar, literally washing day. There was a cultural expectation of bathing. This is actually where the English word Saturday connects back through Norse cultural influence in the Danelaw, which we will get to. The Old English word had different roots, but in parts of Britain under Norse influence, the Saturday bathing tradition persisted into the medieval period. Clothing was also cleaned, though obviously with more effort than we would use today, since the process involved boiling, beating, and wringing rather than a machine that does it for you. Linen undergarments, which the Norse wore as a base layer, were washed more frequently than the outer wool garments, which were heavy and slow to dry but could be brushed and aired. Your hair as a Norse person was a point of personal pride. Both men and women wore their hair long. Men typically had various styles of braids, twists, or simply long loose hair kept clean and combed. Women often wore their hair in elaborate braids and knots. Hair care was not vanity. It was social signaling about the care you took of yourself and, by extension, your household. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written by monks in England who had very strong feelings about Viking raiders, contains a passage that has delighted historians ever since, in which the chronicler complains, with evident irritation, that Norse men in the Danelaw were winning the attention of English women unfairly, because of their habits of washing on Saturdays, changing their clothes regularly, and combing their hair. The monk considered this seductive behavior. The Norse people, one Imagenes, simply considered it Tuesday, or Saturday specifically. Now let us talk about the ships. The Norse longship is genuinely, actually, without any historical exaggeration, one of the most remarkable achievements of medieval engineering. This is a case where the myth does not need inflating, the reality is impressive enough. But impressive engineering achievement and comfortable to travel in are not the same thing, and the experience of actually being on one, rowing it for any extended period of time, deserves some honest description. The Longship was clinker-built. The hull planks overlapped each other like the boards on a clapboard house, riveted together and sealed with a mixture of tar and animal hair or wool. This flexible construction meant the ship could flex and move with the waves rather than fighting them, which made it both faster and more seaworthy than many contemporary vessels. The hull was shallow enough to beach directly on a shore and light enough to be carried overland between river systems. These were genuinely revolutionary design features. The Norse ships could navigate the open Atlantic, cross shallow rivers, and operate in waters that deeper-keeled vessels could not enter. This is a significant part of why Norse explorers and raiders could reach such unexpected places. Iceland, Greenland, North America, the rivers of Russia and Ukraine, the coasts of France and Spain, the Mediterranean. What a longship was not, however, was comfortable. There was no deck. The rowers sat on their sea chests, the wooden boxes that held their personal belongings, and rowed directly on their belongings, with no back support. The ship was open to the sky. The ship was open to the sea, in the sense that spray came over the sides and puddles accumulated on the hull boards, and you might spend a substantial portion of your voyage wet and cold. There was no toilet on a Viking longship. You managed this situation as best you could, which on a ship full of people in close quarters with no privacy required a certain philosophical equanimity about the human body that we no longer particularly cultivate. You slept on the ship when on a voyage. There were no bunks, no cabins, nothing to distinguish the nighttime arrangement from the daytime arrangement, except that you stopped rowing and lay down as best you could among the sea chests and ropes, and whatever provisions were being carried. You would pull the sail down to create a rough shelter over the midsection of the ship if weather required it. The diet on a sea voyage was whatever could be stored without refrigeration: dried fish, dried meat, hard textile flatbreads, dried berries, perhaps barrels of sour milk or beer. Fresh water was carried in barrels and carefully rationed on longer passages. The rowing itself on a calm day was actually not terrible. Norse rowing is well attested as a rhythmic, almost meditative activity, and there is something genuinely peaceful about moving through flat water at a steady pace. But against a headwind, in a sea with significant waves, rowing a longship was one of the most physically demanding things a human being could do, short of combat. Every stroke worked the whole body. Shoulders, back, legs, core, all of it. Hours and hours of it. Days of it sometimes. Norse men who rowed regularly, which was many of them, since even fishermen and traders rowed, had skeletal changes consistent with intensive rowing. Their shoulder joints, their upper backs, their hip flexors. Archaeologists can identify a Norse rower from their bones. You would be very tired. You would also gradually become very strong. Now, since we have mentioned raids, let us address them directly. What was a raid actually like, and who was doing the raiding? The first recorded Viking raid in Western Europe was the attack on the monastery of Lindisfarne, off the Northumberland coast of England, in 793. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records this with barely contained horror. In this year fierce, foreboding omens came over the land of Northumbria. Heathen men made a lamentable havoc in the Church of God in Holy Island. Lindisfarne was a center of learning, a repository of manuscripts and art in silver and gold, and it was staffed by monks who had no military training and no defensive walls. This was exactly the point. Norse raiders were not selecting targets randomly. They were specifically targeting the places in Europe that contained the most portable wealth: monasteries and churches, which had accumulated gold and silver in the form of crosses, book covers, chalices, and reliquaries, and trading towns which had coin and goods. These targets were often on the coast or navigable rivers accessible by ship, and were frequently undefended. From a cold strategic standpoint, it was straightforwardly logical. You had fast ships that could appear without warning. You had a largely agricultural society that occasionally produced young men with no land inheritance, because Norse inheritance customs meant that the eldest son usually got the farm, leaving younger sons to look for opportunity elsewhere. You had wealthy, accessible, relatively undefended targets. The raiders were disproportionately younger sons, landless men and opportunists. They were not the backbone of Norse society going a Viking, they were the economic overflow valve. In a society where land was the primary source of wealth and land was limited and distributed through inheritance, the men who could not inherit needed to find another way. Raiding was one option. Trading was another. Settlement in new lands was a third. Many Norse men who went abroad did all three in the course of a single expedition, raiding where they could get away with it, trading where the opposition was organized enough to make raiding expensive, and settling where the land was good and unclaimed or weakly defended. What the popular image of Viking raiding often misses is how dangerous it was. Monasteries were soft targets, yes. But as the Viking Age progressed and European kingdoms organized defensive responses, building fortifications, stationing troops, coordinating river defenses, raiding became steadily more expensive and more lethal. A fair number of Norse raiders who went out looking for silver came back with nothing, or did not come back at all. The sea itself took many of them. Storms were not interested in the dramatic narrative potential of a Norse warrior's death. For every Norse man who came home wealthy from raiding, there were others who came home with nothing, or not at all, or who made enough to survive but not enough to change their situation significantly. The fantasy of instant wealth was exactly that, a fantasy, with all of fantasy's characteristic relationship to probability. Most Norse farmers stayed on their farms. Most Norse traders traded. Most Norse craftspeople made things. The Viking Age, viewed from inside, looks a lot less like a permanent state of dramatic violence, and a lot more like a society of people trying to manage the agricultural and economic challenges of living in northern Scandinavia, occasionally punctuated by the news that someone's relative had gone abroad and either come back rich or not come back at all. The Norse religious tradition, what we now call Norse mythology, though the Norse themselves did not call it mythology, they called it their religion, was a rich, complex, and deeply woven into daily life system of belief that had almost nothing to do with the version you may have encountered in comic book movies. Let us spend some time here, because it is genuinely fascinating and almost entirely misunderstood. The Norse pantheon was, first of all, not divided into neat hero versus villain categories. The gods were complicated, morally ambiguous figures who could be helpful, capricious, demanding, or absent depending on circumstances. Odin the All-Father, the one-eyed wanderer, was the chief of the gods, but he was not a benevolent grandfather figure. He was a seeker of wisdom who had hung himself on the world tree for 9 days to gain the knowledge of runes, who had sacrificed one eye to drink from the well of wisdom, and who routinely intervened in human affairs in ways that served his own purposes rather than human benefit. Odin was associated with war, wisdom, death, poetry, and magic. He was specifically the patron of warriors who died in battle, those chosen by his shield maidens, the Valkyries, to go to Valhalla. But everyone who dies in battle goes to Valhalla is a simplification. Odin chose the best warriors, and not all battle dead went to his hall. Some went to Freya's hall, Folkvanger. Most people, in fact, were not expected to go to Valhalla at all. Thor, who has become perhaps the most recognizable Norse deity in modern pop culture, was, in actual Norse daily practice, the more commonly worshipped of the two major gods. Where Odin was the patron of aristocrats, kings, and warriors, Thor was the patron of farmers, fishermen, and ordinary people. He was the god of storms and thunder, yes, but he was also the god who kept order, who protected the boundary between the human world and the chaotic forces, the giants, the Jotnar that threatened to overwhelm it. Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, was a ubiquitous protective amulet. Archaeological sites across the Norse world have produced enormous numbers of small Mjolnir pendants in silver, bronze, and iron, worn around the neck exactly as Christians wore crosses. The symbolism was similar: protection, identity, connection to divine power. During the period when Christianity was spreading into Scandinavia, there is even evidence of craftspeople making molds that could cast both cross pendants and Mjolnir pendants, presumably to cover demand from both traditions. Daily religious practice in the Norse world was practical and embedded in ordinary life. There were no professional clergy in the way that Christianity had priests. Instead, the head of the household, typically the male head, though this was not absolute, was responsible for making sacrifices and offerings at significant times. There were blot ceremonies, ritual feasts, and sacrifices at key points of the agricultural year. A winter blot in October or November, a Yule blot in midwinter, a spring blot for the growing season. These were community events involving feasting, drinking, and the sacrifice of animals, typically cattle or horses. The meat was eaten communally after the ritual. This was as much a social event as a religious one, bringing the community together around shared food in the depths of winter, reinforcing the bonds that would get everyone through the dark months. The Norse cosmos had a complex geography, 9 worlds connected by the world tree, Yggdrasil. At its roots lived the serpent Nidhurgr, gnawing. At its crown lived an eagle. A squirrel ran between them, carrying insults in both directions, which is one of the most perfectly Norse details in all of mythology, the specific choice to include a squirrel running back and forth making things worse. There were the Norns, 3 women who sat at the foot of Yggdrasil and wove the threads of fate. Concept of fate, Weird Earther, was central to Norse thought. Things happened because they were meant to happen. A warrior who died in battle died because it was his time. A farmer whose crops failed was subject to forces beyond his control. This was not fatalistic despair, but rather a kind of philosophical acceptance that life contained things you could not change, and the appropriate response was to face them with whatever dignity you could manage. The status of women in Viking Age Norse society is a topic that has generated a great deal of historical debate, some genuine recent revision of older assumptions, and at least one very popular television show that took considerable creative liberties. Let us sort through it carefully. Norse women had, by the standards of the medieval period broadly, a relatively high degree of legal status and personal autonomy. This is not saying they were equal to men; they were not in most formal respects. But they had rights that women in many contemporary societies did not have. A Norse woman could own property. She could inherit property from her family. She could manage that property independently. She could initiate divorce, and this is genuinely striking for the period, by announcing her intention to divorce before witnesses, either at the household threshold or in the bedroom. The household property was then divided, and each spouse took what was theirs. Children typically went with the mother in the case of young children, or stayed on the farm with the parent who kept the farm. This right of divorce was meaningful. It was not easy. Divorce involved social disruption, potential loss of support network, and the practical difficulties of a woman managing independently in an agricultural society. But the legal right existed, was used, and Norse literature, the sagas, contains a number of women who exercised it. A Norse woman who ran a household was called the husfreyja, the house lady, from which we get the English word housewife through a long linguistic journey. The household keys she kept at her belt were not just practical implements; they were symbolic of her authority over the household's resources. She controlled the food stores, the textile production, the household accounts. In a society where the male head of household might be away for extended periods, trading, raiding, attending legal assemblies, the husfreyja ran everything. This was understood and respected. Women were also the primary textile producers, and textile production in the Norse world was not a sideline hobby. Cloth was currency. The ability to produce high-quality linen and wool cloth in quantity was a significant economic skill. Norse women who were skilled weavers were producing tradable goods of real value. Archaeological evidence from Norse sites shows that textile tools, loom weights, spindle whorls are among the most commonly found objects, distributed throughout household contexts. There is also the question of shield maidens, female warriors who appeared in Norse sagas and in a handful of historical references. The evidence for actual female warriors in the Viking Age is limited, but not entirely absent. Recent reanalysis of a significant warrior burial from Birka in Sweden, which had previously been assumed to be male because of its weapons, revealed the skeleton was genetically female. This has generated significant scholarly debate. The saga literature does contain warrior women, valkyries, shield maidens, legendary figures like Hervor who claimed her family's cursed sword. Whether these reflect a real practice of women taking up arms in specific circumstances, or whether they were literary tropes, is still debated. What is clear is that Norse society had a more complex and less rigidly constrained conception of gender roles than some other medieval societies, and that individual Norse women could, in the right circumstances, hold significant power, authority, and even armed capacity within their communities. Here is something that surprises most people about the Viking Age. The Norse traded with Baghdad. Not directly, there were several intermediaries, but Norse traders, primarily Swedes who operated through the river systems of what is now Russia and Ukraine, established trading routes that connected Scandinavia to the Arab world and to the Byzantine Empire. These were the Varangians, and we will give them their own section later, but for now let us consider the trade routes they helped establish. The Arab silver dirham was the most widely circulated silver coin in the Viking Age world. Norse traders in huge quantities accumulated Arab silver and brought it back to Scandinavia. Archaeological hoards from Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Norse-settled areas contain enormous quantities of Arab silver coins, sometimes mixed with other silver objects that had been cut up and weighed, what archaeologists call hack silver, because in Norse trading, silver functioned as a commodity by weight rather than as currency by face value. The goods the Norse were trading varied, depending on the direction of travel. In the east, Norse traders were moving furs, enormously valuable in warmer climates, amber from the Baltic coast, walrus ivory from Arctic waters, honey and slaves, thralls. In return, they received silver, silk, spices, and glassware. Norse sites in Scandinavia have produced Arab silver and Byzantine silk and Iranian glassware, alongside the locally produced material culture. This eastern trade route, the Volga route and the Dnieper route, was one of the most significant commercial arteries of the early medieval world. The Norse were not the only traders on these rivers, but they were important participants. They established trading settlements at key points along the routes, places like Staria Ladoga, Novgorod, and Kiev. The name Rus, from which Russia takes its name, is generally thought to derive from the Norse word for rowers, or possibly from a name applied to Norse traders by the Slavic peoples they encountered. This is one of the least known facts about the Viking Age, that the political and commercial foundations of what would become Russia were laid in part by Norse traders and settlers on the eastern rivers. The Rurikid dynasty, the founding royal dynasty of Kievan Rus, was Norse in origin, founded by a figure named Rurik, or Hrurikr in Old Norse, who established himself at Novgorod in the 9th century. The western trade routes were equally extensive. Norse traders operated throughout the North Sea, the English Channel, and into the Atlantic. Major Norse trading centers, Hedeby in what is now northern Germany, Birka in Sweden, Koppang in Norway, and later Dublin and York in the British Isles, were sophisticated commercial hubs where goods from across the known world changed hands. Norse merchants were, in many ways, the long-haul truckers of the early medieval world, the people who got goods from where they were produced to where they were wanted, at some personal risk, over very long distances. The stereotypical image of the Viking as primarily a raider misses the commercial and logistical sophistication of this trading network, which was the real economic engine of Norse society. One of the most genuinely impressive institutions of Norse society, and one that tends to get crowded out of the popular narrative by all the raids and ships, is the Thing. The thing in Old Norse was a legal and governance assembly, held at regular intervals, typically annually or seasonally, at designated meeting places, at which free members of the community gathered to settle disputes, pass laws, announce marriages and divorces, conduct trials, and generally manage the affairs of the community through a process of collective deliberation. The Thing operated on the principle that all free men had the right to speak and vote. Women could attend but not formally vote, though wealthy and influential women could and did make their views known. Thralls' slaves had no rights at the Thing. The decisions of the Thing were binding. A person declared outlaw utlagi at the Thing was outside the protection of the law. Anyone could kill them without legal consequence. No one was obliged to help them or shelter them, and their property could be seized. This was considered the harshest punishment short of execution, and in a society where survival depended on community networks, it was genuinely devastating. The most famous Thing in the Norse world was the Althing of Iceland, established in 930 at a site called Thingvellir, the Plain of the Thing, in southwestern Iceland. The Althing was the supreme governing body of Iceland for centuries, and Thingvellir remained a symbolically important site throughout Icelandic history. Iceland today still has a parliament called the Althing, making it one of the oldest continuously operating parliamentary traditions in the world, though with many interruptions and transformations along the way. The site of Thingvellir is remarkable, a wide rift valley where the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates are pulling apart, bounded by dramatic basalt cliffs. The law rock from which the law speaker, Logsurgumæður, recited the laws aloud from memory was built into the base of these cliffs. Every 3 years the law speaker had to recite the entire law code of Iceland from memory, which was the primary way that the law was stored before writing became common. The law was a spoken, remembered, performed institution. The Thing system was not perfect. Powerful chieftains could and did use their influence to affect Thing decisions. Wealthy men had more credibility than poor men. The system was prone to all the biases of a face-to-face political community in a stratified society. But it was a genuine system of collective governance, with real procedural rules, real consequences, and real participation by the community. By the political standards of the 9th and 10th centuries, when most of the world was governed by hereditary rulers with no formal checks on their authority, it was remarkable. Let us talk about winter. Not a general concept of winter. Not winter as metaphor for difficulty or hibernation. Actual winter in Scandinavia in the 9th century, without central heating, without electric light, without any of the things that make modern Scandinavian winters tolerable and arguably pleasant. In Oslo, at 60 degrees north latitude, the winter solstice brings approximately 6 hours of daylight. Further north, in the regions of Norway where many Norse people lived, the daylight could be even less, and in the far north there would be periods of polar night with no sun at all. 6 hours of dim, gray, low-angle daylight, during which all outdoor agricultural work, animal care, water fetching, and travel had to be accomplished. The remaining 18 hours were dark. The fire and whatever oil lamps you had, small iron or soapstone lamps burning fish oil, providing roughly the equivalent light of a very dim candle, were your only illumination. This fundamentally restructured human activity. You woke with or slightly before dawn. You worked hard through the short daylight hours. You came inside as light faded. In the long winter evenings, you did indoor work, textile production, tool repair, wood carving, leatherwork. You told stories. You recited poetry. The Norse had a rich oral tradition of skaldic poetry and longer narrative forms that would eventually be written down as the sagas, and this tradition was maintained and developed in the winter evenings around the fire. Winter was also a period of social contraction. Travel was difficult or impossible in heavy snow, particularly in Norway's mountainous terrain or Iceland's often impassable roads. Individual farmsteads might be isolated for weeks. The community that lived in your longhouse was, essentially, the entire world. The people you were stuck in a low, dark, smoky building with for months were the people you had to get along with, regardless of any interpersonal tensions. This proximity, compulsory, continuous, unavoidable, produced both close bonds and occasionally explosive conflicts. The sagas are full of grudges that developed over winter when two families were trapped in close quarters, and eventually erupted in violence in the spring when travel became possible again. The psychological weight of winter in these conditions is hard to overstate for people accustomed to electric light and central heat. The term winter depression, which has a real physiological basis in seasonal affective disorder, caused by reduced sunlight exposure affecting serotonin production, would have been a near-universal experience in northern Scandinavia. The Norse language has many words relating to winter-specific emotional states, a heavy, sluggish, low-effect quality that the long, dark months produced. The midwinter feast, Yule Jal, was not primarily a religious ceremony. It was a survival strategy. At the darkest point of the year, when the cold was most severe and the spring most distant, you gathered your community. You slaughtered some of the livestock that would otherwise be a drain on your dwindling hay stores. You made mead from whatever honey remained, and you feasted and told stories and stayed warm together, and reminded yourself that the days were now, technically, getting longer. It worked. People kept getting through winters. The Norse made beautiful things. This is perhaps the most consistently underemphasized aspect of Viking Age culture in popular imagination, which tends to focus on the destruction rather than the creation. The archaeological record of the Norse world is filled with extraordinarily beautiful and technically accomplished objects: jewelry, weapons, ships, carved wood, textiles, metalwork of all kinds. Norse art had a distinctive style. It was characterized by interlaced animal forms, serpentine beasts winding through and around each other in complex, symmetrical patterns that filled every available surface. These patterns were not random decoration. They were intentional and skilled, following aesthetic rules that changed stylistically over the Viking Age but maintained consistent underlying logic. The metalwork was exceptional. Norse goldsmiths and silversmiths worked in filigree, fine wires twisted into patterns and granulation, tiny balls of metal fused to a surface to create jewelry of breathtaking delicacy. Norse arm rings, neck rings, and brooches combined technical sophistication with that signature animal interlace, aesthetic to produce objects that would not look out of place in a modern jewelry store. The brooches deserve special mention. Norse women's dress was fastened with oval brooches, typically in pairs, worn at the shoulders to hold the outer dress closed. These brooches were status objects as much as fasteners, and their quality ranged from plain iron for everyday working dress to heavily gilded and bejeweled bronze for special occasions. The variety of brooch styles across the Viking Age and across different regions of the Norse world gives archaeologists a remarkably precise dating and provenance tool. Wood carving was another art form practiced at the highest level of technical and aesthetic achievement. The carved wooden portal panels of the Stave Church in Norway, built around 1130, just after the Viking Age but continuous with its aesthetic traditions, show wood carving of such extraordinary quality that they have given their name to the final major art style of the Viking Age, the urn style. The interlacing animals of the urn's carvings are among the most beautiful pieces of art produced in medieval Europe. Everyday woodwork was no less skilled, even if less elaborate. Norse ships, buildings, furniture, and tools show a high level of competence with wood that came from a culture in which everyone worked with the material from childhood. Textile arts, weaving, embroidery, tablet weaving were practiced at a high level. The Bayeux tapestry, which depicts the Norman conquest of England in 1066, was made by English embroiderers but shows the continuation of a needlework tradition with deep Norse connections. Since the Normans who conquered England were themselves descendants of Norse settlers in northern France, Normandy means land of the Northmen. Norse tablet-woven bands, narrow woven ribbons with complex geometric or figural patterns made on small card-like tablets rather than a full loom, have been found in archaeological contexts across the Norse world, often in graves as decorative edging on garments. Beauty was not a luxury in Norse culture. It was a value. Things that were well-made and beautiful were honored. The sword with the beautiful hilt was named. The ship with the fine prow carving was celebrated. The woman who wove the finest cloth was respected. Making things well was not merely practical. It was a statement about your relationship with the world and with the materials you worked. Norse children enter the adult world relatively quickly by modern standards. Childhood, as a distinct and protected phase of life with its own special rules, was not really a Norse concept in the way we understand it today. Children worked. Small children had small tasks, carrying water, herding geese and chickens, gathering firewood, and as they grew, their responsibilities grew with them. A girl of 10 might already be proficient at spinning, helping with cooking, and taking significant care of younger siblings. A boy of the same age would be working alongside adult men in agricultural tasks, learning the skills of the farm through observation and participation. Education was almost entirely apprenticeship-based. You learned what you needed to know by working alongside people who already knew it. For most children, this meant learning farming, animal husbandry, fishing, and the craft specialties of their household. A smith's son learned smithing. A weaver's daughter learned weaving. Skills were family property, passed down within households and occasionally traded as marriage dowries or apprenticeship arrangements. Formal literacy was limited and primarily associated with the runic writing system, which was not used for literature or record-keeping in the way that Roman alphabet writing was in the Christian world. Runes, the futhark, were primarily used for inscriptions, on memorial stones on objects, in short messages or magical formulae. Reading runes was a skill, but it was not the basis of an educational system in the way that literacy was in monastic Europe. The primary educational vehicle for culture, values, history, and cosmology was not writing but speech, the oral tradition of stories, poetry, and proverbs. A child growing up in a Norse household would absorb, through the winter evenings and through communal events, an enormous amount of cultural knowledge. The stories of the gods, the genealogies of famous families, the histories of heroic figures, the legal customs and expected behaviors. This knowledge was not stored in books but in people, and it was transmitted through the arts of memory and performance. The skalds, poets who composed and recited complex verse forms in praise of rulers and warriors, occupied a high-status cultural role in Norse society. Skaldic poetry required extraordinary technical skill. It used elaborate meter, extremely compressed grammar, and kennings, compound metaphorical phrases in which a ship might be called the horse of the waves, and a battle might be the storm of swords. Learning and reciting skaldic verse was considered an accomplishment worthy of respect, and several kings had court skalds whose role was to compose praise poetry celebrating their deeds. Children were also taught the physical skills necessary for life in a Norse environment. Swimming was important and widely practiced. The Norse thought it deeply embarrassing to be unable to swim, and cannot swim appears in the sagas as a mild insult. Skiing and sledding were practical winter transportation skills. Boys were taught weapon handling, though the romantic notion that every Norse boy was trained as a warrior from infancy is somewhat overstated. Most boys were trained as farmers who could defend themselves if necessary, not as professional fighters. The ship burial. The dramatic Viking funeral. The flaming longship sent out to sea. This image is so powerful in the popular imagination that it deserves honest examination. Ship burials, burials in which a person was interred with an actual ship, or a boat, or at least a plank representation of a vessel, did happen. They were real. The Oseberg ship burial in Norway, discovered in 1904, is one of the most extraordinary archaeological finds of the 20th century. A burial mound containing a complete 9th century longship, with 2 female occupants, surrounded by an extraordinary collection of grave goods including carved sleds, wooden carts, weaving equipment, kitchen implements, and textiles. The Oseberg burial was exceptional. Not every Norse person got a ship burial. In fact, most Norse people did not get a ship burial, because ships were extremely valuable and burying one with a dead person represented an enormous sacrifice of resources. Ship burials were for the very wealthy and the very powerful, jarls, kings, and their consorts. The Oseberg women, recent DNA analysis suggests one was local Scandinavian, and one was of non-European origin, possibly from Central or Western Asia, were clearly people of extraordinary status. What most Norse people got was considerably more modest. The majority of Norse burials were either inhumation, burial in the ground, in a pit grave sometimes marked with stones, with or without grave goods, or cremation, burning the body, often with grave goods, and burying or mounding the ashes. The grave goods varied enormously with the wealth and status of the deceased. Grave goods reflected the lived reality of Norse values. A woman might be buried with her household keys, her textile tools, her jewelry, and cooking equipment. A man might be buried with his tools of trade, a blacksmith with hammer and tongs, a merchant with scales and weights, a farmer with farm implements. Warriors were buried with weapons, yes, but weapons were also status symbols, and a high-quality sword might be included in a wealthy man's grave as a marker of social position, regardless of whether he was primarily a fighter. The Norse believed in some form of continued existence after death, but the theological specifics were not uniform and tended to vary by region, period, and individual belief. Valhalla, the Hall of Fallen Warriors, was one afterlife destination. Hell, the realm of most of the dead, a shadowy underground world, was another. The mound where a person was buried was thought to be associated with their continued presence, and ancestors were sometimes consulted for wisdom. The dead were present in Norse, thought in a way that requires a different relationship with burial sites than casual modernity tends to maintain. The famous image of a flaming longship sent out to sea is not entirely mythological. There are some historical references to boat burials that may have included fire, but it was not a standard practice, and the specific image of a ship being pushed out to sea in flames belongs more to the 19th century imagination of the Norse than to historical practice. The Arab traveler Ahmed ibn Fadlan witnessed and described a Norse ship cremation on the Volga in 921 AD, which involved burning the ship on the shore with the deceased inside, along with a sacrificed slave woman. This account is genuine, dramatic, and has been adapted with considerable embellishment in various novels and films. But it was a Russian Varangian practice in a specific context, not a common occurrence throughout the Norse world. In the late 9th century, something changed in the Viking relationship with Britain. The raids, which had been going on since Lindisfarne in 793, escalated into something different, a large-scale military invasion and settlement. The Great Heathen Army, a coalition of Norse warriors and settlers from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, arrived in England in 865 and began a systematic campaign to take territory. Over the following decades, they conquered and settled much of northern and eastern England. The boundary between Norse-controlled England and the Anglo-Saxon Kingdom of Wessex was eventually formalized in a treaty between the Norse leader Guthrum and the Anglo-Saxon King Alfred of Wessex in 886. North and east of a line roughly from London to Chester was the Danelaw, the area under Norse law and authority. The Danelaw was not a foreign occupation in the traditional sense, it was settlement. Norse families came to England, took land, built farmsteads, married local women, and became, over generations, English with Norse habits and Norse names. The linguistic evidence of this settlement is still visible in English today. The words sky, skin, skull, egg, knife, husband, window, anger, die, give, take, and hundreds of other common English words derive from Old Norse. The suffix by in English place names Darby, Grimsby, Whitby, Selby is the Norse word for farm settlement. The suffix thorp, Scunthorpe, Althorpe is Norse for outlying farmstead. The suffix thwaite is Norse for clearing. Norse-descended families gave their children Norse names. Even after conversion to Christianity, added a layer of Christian names, and these names persisted in the English record for generations. The name Eric, Harold, Oswald, and several others common in Anglo-Saxon and later English contexts are Norse or Norse-influenced. The Danelaw produced a fascinating cultural hybrid zone where Norse and English law, language, religious practice, and material culture blended. The legal customs of the Danelaw regions remained distinct from those of Wessex for a considerable time after the Norman conquest. The jury of 12, that forms the basis of the English and American jury system, has been argued to have partial Norse roots in the Norse legal practice of using 12 men to adjudicate disputes. The Norsemen who settled in the Danelaw did not remain Norse in any rigidly defined ethnic sense. They became English in the way that immigrants always become the people of the place they settle in, while leaving their traces in the language, the place names, the legal customs, and the physical landscape. There are communities in Yorkshire and Lincolnshire where the density of Norse place names is so high that it is essentially certain the majority of the medieval population in those areas had Norse ancestry. The Berserkers, the Ulfheithnar, the wolf skins and bear skins, the frenzied warriors who felt no pain, who raged in battle beyond normal human capacity, who bit their shields in battle fury. These figures are real, they appear in the sagas, in skaldic poetry, and in the historical record. They were a recognized category of Norse warrior, associated with Odin, who could grant the berserk state, and with specific warrior brotherhoods or individual identities. But the reality of what a berserker actually was deserves examination, because the popular image has drifted considerably from the historical evidence. The word berserker comes from either bear shirt, björn plus cirker, or possibly bear shirt, someone who went into battle without armor, relying on combat frenzy rather than protection. The berserk state, berserksganger, going berserk, was described as a battle frenzy that made a warrior insensible to pain and fear, gave him exceptional strength, and made him terrifying to opponents. What caused this state? Scholarly theories range from ritualistic psychological preparation, certain meditation or transcenduction techniques, to the use of psychoactive substances. Fly agaric mushrooms have been suggested, though this theory is controversial, to simple adrenaline and trained combat dissociation, to a specific form of what might now be recognized as a dissociative mental state. What is clear from the historical record is that berserkers were not common. They were specialist warriors, attached to the retinues of powerful chieftains and kings who could afford to keep them, and who valued their use as shock troops, men deployed at a critical point in battle to break an enemy line. They were regarded with a mixture of respect and unease even within Norse society. The sagas sometimes depict berserkers as difficult to manage in peacetime, prone to rages and antisocial behavior. King Harald Fairhair of Norway is described in the sagas as having berserkers in his personal bodyguard. They are described as wolf skins and bear skins, howling before battle, biting their shields in fury. These descriptions read as part observation and part literary amplification. The terrifying reputation of berserkers served a military purpose, psychological warfare, that would be enhanced rather than diminished by exaggeration. After the Viking Age in the medieval period, the practice appears to have died out, and berserkers became figures of folklore and saga literature rather than living participants in warfare. Their reputation survived, however, into modern language. Going berserk is a phrase used across multiple languages to mean losing control in a violent or chaotic way. The specific Norse warrior has become a metaphor for all uncontrolled rage. The Mead Hall, the great hall of a Norse chieftain or king, where warriors gathered to feast and drink, to hear poetry, to receive gifts from their lord and give loyalty in return. This image, borrowed partly from the Norse and partly from the related Anglo-Saxon tradition of Beowulf's Heorot, is one that has enormous cultural resonance and is, in its broad strokes, historically accurate. But let us look at what a feast was actually like, at various levels of Norse society. At the level of an ordinary Norse farm, feasting happened at the blot ceremonies we discussed earlier, the seasonal sacrificial feasts where the community gathered, animals were slaughtered, and the resulting food and drink was shared. These were important social events that required the hostess to demonstrate her ability to manage food and drink production at scale, and the host's ability to provide for his community. Norse hospitality customs were serious obligations. A Norse person was expected to offer food and shelter to a traveler, regardless of whether they knew them. Refusing hospitality was a social failure with real consequences. The guest-host relationship was sacred in a fairly literal sense, associated with divine protection, and the obligation ran both ways. Guests were expected to behave appropriately, and hosts were expected to provide generously. There are stories in the sagas of guests who were mistreated, and the narratives treat this as a profound wrong. At the level of a jarl's or king's hall, the feast was more elaborate and more politically charged. The seating arrangement at a Norse feast was a statement of social hierarchy. The most honored guests sat closest to the high seat, the special central seat of the host, and being placed too far down the table was an insult that sagas record leading to feuds and killings. The giving of gifts, arm rings of silver or gold, fine weapons, good horses, was an essential part of the feast's political function. The lord demonstrated his wealth and generosity, and the recipients demonstrated their loyalty. Mead, the fermented honey drink, was the prestige beverage at feasts, while everyday drinking was more likely to involve ale. The mead horn, passed in ceremonial drinking rounds, was associated with vows, oaths, and the formal affirmation of loyalties. To drink with someone from the same horn was to be in relationship with them in a formal sense. The act of drinking was embedded in social meaning. Food at a significant feast might include roasted meats, cattle, pigs, sheep, game, fish preparations, bread made from the best available grain, dried fruits, cheese, and various preserved items that represented luxury or rarity in the Norse diet. The quality and quantity of food at a feast was a direct statement of the host's resources and their willingness to share them. The entertainment at feasts, skaldic recitation, storytelling, perhaps music on a lyre, was serious business. A good skald could preserve or destroy a reputation through verse, and the patronage relationship between a Norse lord and his poet was one of genuine mutual dependence. The lord got glory, the poet got a livelihood, gifts, and the social protection of powerful patronage. Feasting was not merely eating. It was the performance of community, hierarchy, loyalty, and generosity in a society where these values were the primary social glue. The mead hall was a theater of Norse social relations as much as a place to eat and drink. This is one of those historical footnotes that sounds entirely made up but is absolutely, thoroughly documented. For several centuries, the Byzantine emperors in Constantinople, the rulers of the most sophisticated and wealthy state in the medieval world, employed a personal bodyguard composed primarily of Norse warriors. The Varangian Guard, Varangians being the Byzantine Greek word for Norse or Scandinavian, was established in the 980s under Emperor Basil II, who was dealing with a succession crisis and needed reliable troops who had no local political entanglements and were loyal only to the emperor personally rather than to any of the competing Byzantine factions. Norse warriors came to Constantinople via the Varangian River routes, down through what is now Russia and Ukraine, across the Black Sea. The pay and conditions in the Varangian Guard were extraordinarily generous by Norse standards: regular salary in gold, access to the legendary wealth of Constantinople, and special privileges including the right to loot the imperial treasury when an emperor died, a custom called polyplanismos, palace plundering. which must have made every emperor acutely aware of the need to keep the guard well compensated during his lifetime. What the Varangians found in Constantinople was a world completely unlike anything in their experience. Constantinople in the 10th and 11th centuries had a population of around 400,000 to 500,000 people, at a time when the largest Norse settlements were in the hundreds to very low thousands. The city had running water, sewage systems, a hippodrome for chariot racing, enormous churches covered in gold mosaics, a university, markets selling goods from the entire known world, and a bureaucracy of terrifying complexity. Norse graffiti has been found carved on the marble parapets of the Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral of Constantinople, now a mosque, which is an extraordinary artifact of cultural contact. Varangian guards, standing their long, boring hours of watch duty in the most magnificent building in the medieval world, doing what bored guards everywhere do, carving their names in whatever flat surface was available. Harald Hardrada, Harold Sigurdsson, who would later make his failed bid for the English throne at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, 3 days before the Norman conquest, served in the Varangian Guard as a young man. He fought in North Africa, in the Middle East, and throughout the Byzantine Empire, accumulating both wealth and military experience before returning to Norway to claim the throne. His career illustrates perfectly the range of experience and opportunity available to ambitious Norse men of the Viking Age. From Norway to Byzantium to Russia to England to his death on an English battlefield in 1066. In approximately the year 1000, 5 centuries before Columbus, a Norse explorer named Leif Erikson sailed west from Greenland and made landfall on the coast of North America. This is not mythology. It is archaeology. The site of Elance Ox Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada, excavated in the 1960s by the Norwegian archaeologist Helge Ingstad and his wife, the archaeologist Anne Stein Ingstad, is an undisputed Norse settlement dating to around 1000 AD. 8 buildings in the Norse Longhouse style, ironworking tools, Norse-specific structural features, and radiocarbon dating all confirm. Norse people were in North America 5 centuries before European contact was supposed to have happened. Leif Erikson was the son of Eric the Red, who had himself discovered and colonized Greenland after being exiled from Iceland for manslaughter. Eric had discovered Greenland while looking for a landmass that another Norse sailor had glimpsed by accident after being blown off course. This chain of accidental and semi-accidental discovery, Norse exploration, was often driven by navigational error, and the vast trackless Atlantic eventually led to North America. The Norse sagas give 2 somewhat inconsistent accounts of the Vinland voyages in the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red. Both agree on the basic facts, that Norse settlers reached a land to the west of Greenland where wild grapes grew, hence Vinland, wine land, and where the growing conditions seemed excellent. Both also agree that the settlement attempts eventually failed, primarily because of conflict with the indigenous peoples the Norse called Skrælings. The Norse and the indigenous peoples of Newfoundland, probably ancestral Beothuk or a related culture, had some trading contact and some violent conflict. The Norse found that their small numbers and the distance from any support made maintaining a permanent settlement impossible in the face of indigenous resistance. The Vinland settlement was abandoned after perhaps a decade, and though Norse ships from Greenland continued to visit the North American coast occasionally for timber and other resources over the following centuries, no permanent Norse colony was established. What might have been a Norse North America, 5 centuries of Norse contact with indigenous peoples before the Spanish and Portuguese, is one of history's more tantalizing counterfactuals. But it did not happen. The Norse came, stayed briefly, left, and were mostly forgotten outside of their own oral tradition, until the archaeological finds of the 1960s confirmed what the sagas had described. Iceland deserves its own section because Icelandic Norse culture produced something extraordinary. The written sagas, the most sophisticated prose literature of medieval Northern Europe, written down in the 13th and 14th centuries, but largely preserving stories, histories, and cultural knowledge from the Viking Age. Iceland was settled by Norse colonists beginning around 874 AD, primarily from Norway, many of them, according to tradition, fleeing the centralizing power of King Harald Fairhair, and from Norse communities in the British Isles, bringing with them Celtic-speaking thralls and spouses from Ireland and Scotland, whose genetic legacy is still visible in the Icelandic population today. Iceland was, as we have mentioned, a challenging place for a Norse-style agricultural society. There was essentially no timber beyond low birch scrub. The soil, though surprisingly fertile in the southern valleys, was thin and vulnerable to the overgrazing that early settlers, not understanding the fragility of the Icelandic ecosystem, promptly inflicted on it. Soil erosion from overgrazing stripped large areas of Iceland of their vegetative cover within a few generations of Norse settlement, a phenomenon visible to this day in the denuded highlands of the interior. The winters in Iceland were long and dark. The geothermal activity, geysers, hot springs, volcanic eruptions, was alien to Norse experience and required new theological interpretation. Volcanoes had no place in the Norse cosmology that had been developed in relatively geologically stable Scandinavia. Icelandic Norse culture incorporated these violent geological facts into a landscape of myth and story, and the volcanic, world-ending imagery of the Norse apocalypse, Ragnarök, may reflect an Icelandic sensibility shaped by living in a place where the earth actually opened up and destroyed things on a regular basis. But Iceland also produced, in the Althing, a functioning democratic governance system that was remarkably stable for an island with no central authority, no standing military, and no coercive power capable of enforcing law except through social sanction and the collective agreement of free men. For 3 centuries, Iceland was governed almost entirely through the Thing system, the chieftains Gathar, who held formal religious and political roles, and the court systems that adjudicated disputes. The saga literature that this culture produced, the family sagas, the king's sagas, the mythological sagas, is a body of literature that scholars rank alongside Homer and the Bible as foundational texts of Western literary culture. Works like Engjal's Saga, Egil's Saga, the Völsunga Saga, which inspired both Wagner's Ring Cycle and Tolkien's Legendarium, and the Vinland sagas are sophisticated literary achievements that deal with questions of honor, fate, family, law, and the nature of violence in ways that remain deeply readable and genuinely moving. The Viking Age is generally said to end in 1066 with the Battle of Stamford Bridge, where Harald Hardrada's invasion of England was defeated by King Harold Godwinson, and the subsequent Norman conquest of England, where the Normans, themselves Norse descendants, completed the transformation of English political culture. But the end of the Viking Age was not a dramatic moment. It was a gradual process that had been underway for decades. The Christianization of Scandinavia, the consolidation of Norse territories into stable kingdoms, the settling of Norse populations throughout Britain and the Atlantic Islands, and the integration of those communities into local cultures. The conversion to Christianity was the most significant change. Norway's King Olaf Haraldsson, Sint. Olaf converted the Norwegian Church to Roman Christianity in the early 11th century through a combination of genuine religious conviction and fairly direct coercion. Denmark had been Christianized somewhat earlier under Harald Bluetooth. Yes, the wireless communication standard is named after a Viking Age Danish king, because Harald united the Danish tribes just as Bluetooth technology unites communication devices. This is either a very clever marketing decision or an extraordinarily nerdy one, possibly both. Sweden converted more gradually over the 11th century. Christian conversion brought Norse society into the Latin literate culture of medieval Europe. Monks and priests wrote things down, chronicles were kept, church governance imposed new administrative structures. The oral tradition that had been the primary vehicle of Norse cultural memory was gradually supplemented and then partially supplanted by written records. The Longship still sailed. Norse traders were still moving goods across the North Sea, and the Baltic well into the 12th and 13th centuries. The Thing assemblies still met. The farms still produced porridge and dried fish. But the political and religious structures that had characterized the Viking Age, the independence, the fluid allegiances, the pagan religious practices, the raiding that had terrified coastal Europe, were being progressively replaced by the more standardized institutions of Christian medieval Europe. The Norse did not disappear. They became Norwegians, Danes, Swedes, Icelanders, Orcadians, Shetlanders, Manx, Irish Norse, Yorkshire farmers with Norse surname, Norman lords, Russian princes, Byzantine guards. They became